So good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Brad Epley. I'm the Chief Conservator here at the Menil Collection, and my colleague Christina Mclean and I will be giving a presentation about the Artist Documentation Program this evening. I wanted to thank you all for coming out, despite the chilly weather and despite the fact that the World Series required a Game 7 tonight to find a winner. But thank you for coming. I'd also like to acknowledge the Anchorage Foundation of Texas for their generous support of public programs at the Menil this year. And also to remind everybody that the next public program is on next Thursday, November 7th, when distinguished anthropologists Howard and Frances Murphy will discuss mapping in Australian Aboriginal art with the Menil's Curator for Collections, Paul Davis. And that's on the occasion of our Mapawia exhibition. So before we start, just a note to silence your cell phone, please. And also to let you know we reserve some time at the end, so if you could please hold your thoughts and questions until then, we'll have time to address them at that point. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the field of conservation is basically involved with preserving the physical materials of artworks and artifacts. As conservators, we actively intervene through treatments to stop or address decay and damage. And we also work with our museum colleagues to ensure stable climates, to minimize the risks in installations and in storage conditions. And while I emphasize the physical, there are also many immaterial parts to this equation, and as you will see this evening, sometimes only immaterial parts. In 1991, Carol Mancusi-Ungaro started the Artist Documentation Program to address growing needs in the field of contemporary art conservation. Carol was the first chief conservator here at the Menil and was and continues to be a very strong and innovative voice in the field of contemporary art conservation. The Artist Documentation Program arose organically from what was happening around Carol. The museum had opened in 1987, and several artists were coming to see their work that was in the collection. And Carol recognized the value of the opportunity of recording the impressions as artists revisited their work for the first time in decades in many cases. There are several fundamental tenets to the Artist Documentation Program that were established at that point and that we maintain today. First and foremost, the conversations occur between artist and conservator. And also importantly, the presence of the artwork is critical. The conversations take place with at least one and ideally many representations of the artist's work to both stimulate and to give additional context to each response the artist gives. The discussions are always open-ended. That's to say they don't follow a strict questionnaire or formula. And while we do address questions of materials and techniques, the conversations are really more about teasing out the artist's ideas about how they've seen their own work age, how they've seen their work conserved, what they have liked and not liked, and what their wishes are for the future preservation of their work. And also, the conversations are videoed, not only to document the condition of the work at the time of the conversation, but also to record some additional nuances that you lose in transcripts or audio recordings only. So there's pauses and gestures and other points of emphasis that the artists can give that can help both us and future conservators have additional context for the answers. And then also, I just wanted to point out that originally the Artist Documentation Program was intended as an in-house resource only. This is the first interview that Carol did as part of the ADP. It was with the artist Mel Chin. Carol moved from the Menil in 2001, taking up a dual position at the Whitney Museum of American Art and Harvard University Art Museums. Carol and her colleagues there continued to do interviews with under the tenets of the ADP, and we continued to do them here at the Menil as well. And it was interesting because the Whitney actually provided a unique opportunity through the number of artist retrospectives that they undertake there to give additional rich context for these interviews. So by 2010, there were a combined 33 interviews across the partners, and Carol and I approached the Mellon Foundation for funding to create a joint archive here at the Menil for all of the interviews. So an ADP archivist was hired. The earliest interviews were digitized. and edited to include images and B-roll footage, and permissions were revisited with the artists. We created a website which launched in 2012, and moving from an in-house resource made all of the interviews accessible. We received a second round of funding in 2012 to continue the gains and procedures we'd established in the first grant. And then again in 2016, Carol and I approached the Mellon Foundation, this time with the idea of establishing fellowships as part of the artist documentation program. We wanted the opportunity to create the opportunity for emerging conservation professionals to immerse themselves within an existing artist interview program. And now that interviewing is part of the formal conservation training education for conservators, recent graduates had the potential to bring expectations and new ideas regarding the practice of interviewing, the format, and the accessibility of the content. Carol and I also wanted to demonstrate the far-reaching potential of the ADP content, exploring not only how these were used within the field, but also to demonstrate the potential of interviews for deeper dives outside the specifics of conservation treatments. Therefore, part of the fellowship requirement is publishable research, based on the opportunity to expand the ideas raised in the existing artist interviews and extending the conversation to other players, artist assistants, estates, other artists, and conservators who have utilized the information in these interviews. So for example, Christina's research, she focused on the potential presented by the pending publication of Carol's 2005 interview with the artist Sol LeWitt, the establishment of an archive of LeWitt's wall drawings at Yale University, and their hiring of an archivist, John Hogan. You'll hear much more from him later in Christina's portion. LeWitt's ongoing retrospective of wall drawings at Mass MoCA that was initially set to last for 25 years and has now been extended to 35, so go see it while you can. And Carol's unique perspective with LeWitt's work both as a conservator and as a curator. And this image just shows a recent interview that was conducted with the artist Mineko Grimmer. Many of you may remember her installation that was here. And the interview was undertaken by our assistant objects conservator, Megan Perry, and Christina Mclean. So before I pass the baton to Christina, I just wanted to make a few points about the idea and the notion of artistic intention. So the concept of artistic intent has really evolved over the last 40 years with the practice of interviewing artists. Intent is really no longer seen as a static or fixed point. It is time, culture, and technology dependent. And retrospectively, in thinking of the artist's memory, it relates and relies heavily on the work that the artist has subsequently done. Furthermore, it's really better understood that intent evolves through the course of production rather than some ideal that is worked towards. And therefore, it is a continuum, and it changes as the artwork is interpreted as it moves through time. And this is just a little timeline that I think illustrates the different points at which the artwork is interpreted, its creation, its exhibition, its acquisition, and maybe its conservation treatment, either by conservators or even by scholars, curators, etc. It's also important to note that the artwork acquires additional stakeholders as it moves through time. So an increasingly important fact for contemporary art is that preserving the intent may or may not be contingent on preserving the original materials. So the life of the artwork may be completely irrespective of the life of the materials. So as conservators, historically, conservation has been about the preservation of intent through preservation of original materials. And as new practices and materials are utilized, the fundamental question becomes understanding the relevance of original materials to contemporary artistic practice and what our roles as conservators is in that equation. So finally, just to close this introductory part, I've chosen 3 clips to demonstrate the range in which artists think about notions of original material, the relevance of the artist hand, and how their materials age and can be changed through time. So there's a clip from Bryce Martin, and then there's a clip from Richard Serra, and a clip from Sarah Z. In most cases, the introductory question might be clipped a little bit, but they're each talking about those issues I talked about, so hand, original intent, and changeable materials.
Marks of the process as opposed to other kind of aging, either from vandalism or other types of natural aging?
Yeah, I mean, I like to think of it as patination. I mean, I've seen people go in and they want to have the painting fixed because there's a mark, and it's, well, what do? Do you reduce the whole surface to get rid of a mark? What's better? And I've kind of, in the long run, I've opted for leave the marks. I mean, it's a drag. This is like, some of the marks are pretty bad. They were like, big circular crack things and stuff like that. I mean, there's one that's being worked on now that has a big thing right in the middle of the painting. It totally destroys the painting. And the problem with monochromatic things is, like, if you do have some sort of mark there, it can be, against the intent of the painting. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, my tendency now is to say leave it, let it patinate, because they're pretty funky to begin with. These aren't pristine surfaces. They're never meant to be. They're carefully worked and everything, but they're not pristine. I mean, it has to do with the hand, and it's not like spray gun or something where there's no hand, and it's a very fine surface.
Material sitting on something, whereas the installation drawings, that distinction is really not there. They are kind of in the same.
They're more autonomous surfaces.
Right. Okay.
And that's what they need to be. I don't want people to get hung up on what they look like interior to themselves, other than what they're delineating in the room.
Because for this exhibition, you did do some different iterations of works like Pacific Judson Murphy, Blank, Abstract Slavery, or I guess a new iteration of them specifically for this.
They're all the same size. They're exactly the same size as they were. Emmy Pullister has her in her museum there, and she's lent it out a few times, and every time you put them up and down, you have to staple the edges so they get frayed. And she asked me if I could do one if it was going to travel this exact same size, and I said, sure, I'll do that.
Okay. Because again, it's really not about the surface, it's about its effect on the space. Okay.
Yeah. I think if people get hung up on the aura of the original object, they're missing the point with the canvas drawings. They're not about that.
Those organic elements, anytime you come to the piece, are going to be at a certain stage in their development is interesting. I don't know if you know, another thing that sort of affected my thinking on work evolving is a place called the Issei Shrine. Have you ever heard of it?
No.
It's this incredible shrine in Japan that for Japanese is very important, where they have two shrines right next to each other, and they're made from raw wood, and they get rebuilt. One gets rebuilt and the other gets rebuilt every year. So at any time you go to see the shrine, one is being built and the other one is aging. And it's happened for literally centuries. And they train a person who is a national monument, the craftsperson. There's been this lineage of a person who knows how to make the shrine for centuries. And it's actually that person, that skill, that is the value. But when you go, it has this incredible feeling of this process that's happened over this immense time, and any time you go, you're going to see one decaying and one growing. So in the same way, I think inevitably, anytime you'd come to this piece, those certain elements would be fresh. They would be, as you said, what's that point? But at the point of where they're neglected or unkempt, or somewhere in between. And that's part of seeing the piece, is that when you come to the piece, you know that you're seeing it at a time in its life cycle.
And so now I'll pass to Christina Mclean.
I want to thank you all for coming out. I'm sure you had other places that you could have gone this evening, so I really appreciate that you took the time to come out and hear me speak. This talk is the accumulation of some of the work that I've been doing over the last 2 years during my fellowship at the Menil, and I can't wait to tell you about what I've learned about Sol LeWitt over these last 2 years. Sol LeWitt was a prominent leader in the development of conceptual art, and whose prolific career spanned over five decades. He produced over 1,300 wall drawings, in addition to embracing a variety of other media, including three-dimensional structures and works of art on paper. The influence of LeWitt's work as a conceptual artist prompted a shift away for the way in which works are created, considered, and ultimately conserved. The conservation of a LeWitt wall drawing requires a de-emphasis on the preservation of specific material manifestations of the work. Instead, the main focus of conservation's efforts should be placed on documenting both the conceptual and material context for each unique wall drawing. This is key so that future generations can continue to realize the work as LeWitt and his drafters established. The first wall drawing was created in 1968 for a group show at the Paula Cooper Gallery in New York. This would mark the beginning of a nearly 40-year exploration into generating artwork utilizing the wall surface. LeWitt had come to the conclusion that by eliminating the requirement of a support, such as canvas, that he could emphasize the two-dimensionality he was looking for in these wall drawings. The true innovation of LeWitt's wall drawings was not about drawing directly on the wall. The progression was the removal of the artist's hand from the execution of the work and the wall drawing's proposed temporality. The impetus for the initial concept was regularly developed with the final installation site in mind. Diagrams were made after the completion of an installation in hopes that it would provide a distilled and translatable representation of the concept. The wall drawings confronted what it means to be an original work of art and redefined the terms by which art could be purchased and owned. This meant that even after the completion of an exhibition, a wall drawing would still continue to exist in its form as an idea. The concept in waiting will remain represented as a tangible set of written instructions, a certificate of authenticity as well, and as drawn instructions. Shortly after the first few wall drawings were created, LeWitt recognized that his art was fundamentally a framework of ideas, and the execution need not be completed by his own hand. LeWitt conceives of wall drawings as instructions of varying specificity, and these instructions are given to the drafter with a full understanding that each individual might have a slightly different interpretation of these instructions. This therefore creates a level of variance in the resulting completed wall drawings. LeWitt accepted, encouraged these interpretive possibilities, and recognized the drafters as collaborators in his work. The wall drawing remains the artist's work as long as the plan is followed correctly. And when he first conceived of this conceptual framework, he was more open to the possibility that anyone with the instructions could likely realize the work. Very soon thereafter, he realized this was a bit idealistic, and he identified that it was not purely intuitive process. Some individuals could execute the work much better than others, and he recognized that skilled workmanship was important for portraying clarity of his concepts. So Carol Mancusi-Ungaro interviewed Sol LeWitt twice during 2005 in his Connecticut home. He wished not to be filmed for the interview. That was his preference. So instead, 2 audio recordings were generated of this interview. Carol found that she didn't have all the clarity that she wanted at the end of these interviews. So in talking with Sol LeWitt, he suggested that she write questions in the margins of the transcripts and that he would then respond with answers. So what was created were 2 audio interviews in addition to this really rich textual document. So here's Sol talking from that interview.
One of the first great revelations I had about myself as an artist was that I was a poor technician. And the second great revelation was that there's always somebody who can really do it well. Mm-hmm. And the third one is to find that.
Right. Exactly. And that's the heart of this discussion.
And once you find them, don't let them go. So it's just a matter of finding people that can. There's so many different kinds of things that have to be done. You can't be an expert in all of them. And in my case, I'm an expert in none of them.
But you are the artist.
Except what I do myself in my studio, then that's what I'm expert in, but no one else can do those. And so that's what I do. But other work, almost all the other work, I only used assistants at the beginning for wall drawings because when the space got too large, I couldn't do it myself. And so then I found out that a lot of people could do it very well, much better than I could.
Okay.
One of the first great...
Okay.
In the summer of 1967, LeWitt published paragraphs on conceptual art. This was a series of statements that he made about his work, and one statement that has been made popular in writings on LeWitt is on the screen here. So it says, all of the planning and decisions are made beforehand, and the execution is a perfunctory affair. The idea becomes a machine that makes the art. I'm unsure if perfunctory was ever the most appropriate term here, but it can certainly be viewed as an artifact of LeWitt's thinking during the 1960s and 70s. The essence of many of these statements still ring true, but I believe they should remain contextualized as a part of his earlier thinking. The execution eventually became anything but perfunctory. We see LeWitt refining his thinking greatly as the amount of intrinsic knowledge required by the drafters intensified, as well as the wall drawings grew in number and complexity. I believe LeWitt would agree with this emphasis on the contextualization because he acknowledged the possibility that his imperatives will change with time and through his own experience, which in hindsight is exactly what happened. Here, LeWitt articulates the importance of why, as conservators, we should revisit interviews with an artist at different points during their career in order to better capture their evolving thoughts. In response to this necessity, the ADP took this on as an imperative and increasingly has sought to repeat interviews with artists at different points in their career. This happened with George Herms. He was interviewed in 1991 and then again in 2017. David Novros was interviewed in 95 and also 2005. And then Mel Chin, whose 91 interview inaugurated the program, as Brad indicated, was also interviewed 23 years later. So to gain additional perspective on the ideas discussed in Carroll's interview with Sol LeWitt, I was able to conduct an interview with his longstanding draftsman, John Hogan. These conversations, both the LeWitt-Carroll conversations and my conversation with John, helped to provide insight into the progression of LeWitt as acting as his own drafter, to issuing his own hand for that of a collaborative team, to passing down knowledge of installation parameters to a select group through the practical execution of the work, and finally in establishing an archive which theoretically facilitates the work's continuation in perpetuity. So here's John speaking to these developments.
So it's always functioned, but part of it, how it's functioned, is that it's this, verbal one-to-one apprenticeship kind of thing. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do here is create an environment where we have examples of how the work is done and executed. So if there comes a break in that system, where perhaps somewhere in the future the work falls out of popularity for some reason, or
And isn't being installed.
it isn't being installed, and there becomes a linear break in time where there's nobody who's left who knows how to do the work. There is a resource here that says, well, these are what the formulas are. Here's a video of how the work was done. Here's a sample board of how the lines are drawn. Here's a sample of what the texture or what the wall is supposed to look like. So there is a resource here. But also, we never approached it that way before. It was really only since this position came into existence where we started to think, well, that was part of the intention of why this position was created, was that Sol approached Yale and said, I'll gift you all these works, but I want to have some notion of this archive and this resources place that will guarantee that there's a way to be able to execute. There's an ability to understand how to execute, that the materials and methods are maintained as a resource, so that over time it'll continue. So that's one of the things that, up until Sol became ill and ultimately passed away, it wasn't something we ever really addressed because it worked.
Yeah.
There was no reason to think about it. It worked. When there was a problem, we'd ask him how he wanted to deal with it, and it was fine. But he was ill for several years, but had his wits about him and said, "Oh, well, it's worked really well, but now how's it going to work after I'm gone?" And it wasn't that people, and there were also curators and other artist friends, and said, "Sol, what's going to happen to your work after you go?" So it wasn't like he was, it was something that got addressed head on. Certainly not something that I would consider was an easy thing for him to think about. But, he wanted to make sure that the work would have a continuum. And certainly from the get-go, he had a system in place that sort of lent itself to it continuing, but he still wanted some other further reassurances that long-term, it doesn't simply become a lot of stuff in a barn somewhere that got forgotten.
Sol LeWitt saw the drafters as true collaborators in his art and just respected and embraced the innovation that they brought to the process. The human interpretation of his instructions was and will always remain important to the works. Interpretation, or perhaps more appropriately, transposition, is carried out by a lead drafter with vast knowledge of the installation process and experience with those previous installations. This individual will possess a deep understanding of the conceptual nature of the work and a skilled knowledge of the materials and techniques necessary for a successful installation. The most important quality needed in a drafter is their ability to suppress their own ego and embrace working collectively with a democratic hand. Democratic hand implies that each hand complements and counteracts any nuances of the other individual's hand. The goal of working with a democratic hand lent itself to the large format of many of the wall drawings, and it's something that Sol LeWitt felt very, very strongly about. This democratic hand is also part of the reason why the systematic training of drafters developed as it did. The specification of lead drafters was about hand skill, but it was also about their ability to anticipate, detect, and correct the development of any idiosyncratic features within a developing wall drawing. Sol LeWitt trusted his drafters and allowed them to work with a high level of autonomy, but this trust was always something to be earned, and in order to respect the system, you need to deeply understand the system. So here, John's going to talk about that a bit more. I think this is the next one. This is gone. I think it's the next one. Let's find it.
It had to be human involvement. It had to be that it was a collaboration between somebody who read it and then followed the instructions. But that's not to say that we want to do things the hard way if there's an easier way to do it. So, some people would say, well, it's always been done this way and it's always going to be done this way. It's like, as long as you do it according to his system, that if it's an ink process, it's 3 passes. If it's a acrylic piece, it's this. If it's a scribble piece, it's this. But, he created these very specific systems to create the work. Respect the systems, bring any new skills to them, but don't change the system.
And how does that go with transposing into a new medium? So
again, Sol wasn't somebody who worked in his studio figuring out that stuff. He would say, well, this is what I want. What do you think? How do we do this? So even with the ink drawings, it was a matter of him saying, well, he wanted to do these wall-based pieces that were done with ink. He understood printmaking. He understood. He had worked as a graphic designer. He understood the context of what it means to work with process colors. So he brought that knowledge to it and said, okay, so can I bring that fairly universal approach to technology and bring it to a system to create the artwork on the wall? So, if you understand process colors, then it's like, again, ideas that are universal, materials that are readily available, skill groups that are basic, it's not about mixing some luscious purple. It's not about mixing a particular orange. It's a combination of these three things, and that's what you get. And it's a commitment to respect that system.
Well, these concepts of temporality, originality, irrespective of the executing hand, were fairly radical when Sol LeWitt first proposed them. Since then, they've been accepted and explored by other contemporary artists. In order to align the practices of artist and conservator, new working relationships and methodologies were needed to ensure that the changes used in the use of materials and the conceptual underpinnings of artistic practice would be reconciled within the ethics of conservation. My primary research involved documenting the historic and contemporary decision-making by which LeWitt made manifest in his wall drawings. I was also curious to know if exploring LeWitt's conceptual practice would help me better understand the work of other artists that had adopted these principles into their own. One such artist is Casey Reese. Reese created a body of work as a part of a commission for the Whitney Museum of American Art that specifically responded to Sol LeWitt's wall drawings. But even separate from these, conceptually his art is akin to LeWitt by relying on established rules and permissible outcomes within a software-based program. Like LeWitt, the successful installation of Reese's work relies fundamentally on appreciation for the rule-based system driving it rather than being specific to any projector, operator, or computer. As time passes, technologies utilized by Reese will inevitably face obsolescence, but because of the adherence to rules, any migration of these technologies should not affect the viability of the work. Nevertheless, as with LeWitt, the rules that underpin the work require some degree of interpretation, so therefore the variables must be understood before they can be applied. So this is Casey Reese. It's not a video clip, it's audio only. And he's speaking about a work entitled Path. And this work first was manifest as drawings because the software wasn't at the level that he wanted it to be at before he could execute it in software. And then later on, he revisited it in software. We were talking about Path, and if it's, I think I asked if the work if this is now just a new iteration of that work, or are they separate works?
Well, the original work were the drawings, and those drawings remain as they are and as they were. So in this particular case, it didn't exist as a software work before. So I created a software work from the. So the code existed, but it wasn't work that was. It was code that was from making the paper-based media for the drawings, and so I modified that code to create a new work from that same period. And then when I ever need to restore a work that was originally software, I keep it as close to the original as possible. Okay. And so those things, oftentimes they need to change because the operating system of the computers change and they just won't run the code anymore, or the display technology changes. So, for example, a screen might have been made for a low resolution screen, and it should be modified for a current resolution screen.
Yeah.
And so the work changes when that happens, but it changes in I would say, a minor way. Maybe that's a little bit like doing the same wall drawing on different walls. Yeah, and I think for me, the essence of the work isn't really how it looks. It's how the images convey the underlying system that's there. So I think of that as really the essence. So when it gets modified for whatever the current technology is, it does change visually, but that's unimportant to me because the core is still there.
We were talking about path, and if it's
I think also, maybe I didn't talk about it, but installation.
Sorry, that's a teaser for the next clip. The adherence to fundamental systems instead of a reliance on accessible tools, as showcased in both Reese's and LeWitt's work, emphasized how the work is maintained despite the passage of time. This very important task to uphold the integrity of LeWitt's work makes a clear separation between the interpretive elements for the drafters to work around and also establishing protocols that help with the consistency between installations. There have been efforts to establish these protocols and decision-making processes which seek to bring about this consistency. For example, when you're installing a wall drawing, it's about how you put the ink on the wall. It's about some of the formulation of the ink and the passes. With a scribble drawing, it's about the pencil and how you hold it and the weight and the patterning of that scribble itself. So additionally, documentation of the decision-making processes of those select materials is of critical importance, and that's because within LeWitt's own lifetime, we saw a discontinuation of some of the materials he was using in the pencil drawings and in the ink process drawings. So because they were discontinued within his own lifetime, he made a point of saying that didn't affect the viability of the work and that it could go on with different materials as long as those materials were in keeping with certain aspects of those original materials and the qualities of those. So these different materials throughout time have been collected at Yale University's West Campus in the archive, and this is in addition to sample boards of the different permutations used to arrive at a desirable alternative. So all of those are being kept so that in the event that we have another discontinuation of materials, we have that decision-making process documented so that we can then potentially do it again, and then again after that. LeWitt also accepted the inherent idiosyncrasies of the walls he was given and incorporated these elements into his planning. There has to be some control over the variables, and that's why continuity of drafter to drafter is so important. So here's Casey Reese talking again. Let me move it to the beginning.
I think also, maybe I didn't talk about it, but installation variability too is essential to a lot of this work. A lot of the software work when it's projected, which has been my preferred method over the last many years, it is almost always projected floor to ceiling and edge to edge with the wall. And that was another Whitney compromise, was not being able to do that. And so the work changes with each wall. The aspect ratio changes. And as we know, walls are idiosyncratic. I think you're showing work on software which is inherently immaterial, but I need to be in precise control over the environment in order to display that immaterial work. And that includes the lighting, all those details. And that's something that I learned a lot from reading about the relationship between the ambiguity of maybe the instructions for a LeWitt piece and the precision at which they need to be executed.
So until recently, this system predominantly functioned as a one-on-one apprenticeship, causing many of the immaterial intricacies integral to understanding these concepts to only be known within a trusted cohort of drafters. As a result, these immaterial intricacies might not appear readily understandable to someone just going through the catalog raisonné. And here's John talking a little bit more about that.
So
Those are different.
those are things that are not necessarily readily known or available to the general public by looking at the catalog raisonné, but they are referenced within internal reference. So the same way.
They're established internally.
Right. So essentially that's relative to this notion of what it would be here with this concept of materials would also be, these are how these processes work. This is what this means. When it says that it's a not straight line, it means it's done this way. If it's a broken line, it means it's done this way. So essentially it would become sort of a materials and methods reference. Again, there's only 4 or 5 different processes, so it's not particularly complicated, but it is information that is essential.
So while not a prescriptive formula, this line of thinking fundamentally changes the approach conservation might take towards a conceptual, formulaic, or rule-based work of art entirely. In some ways, the approach becomes a little more akin to archival documentation, and which, when discussed in theory, sometimes sounds simple, but in practice, it can be extremely complex. So here's Casey talking about the highlights and the benefits of creating a rule-based work, and specifically in software for him.
Yeah, I mean, I really believe deeply that that the software-based work is more archival than works that are made in material. Mm-hmm. I mean, with this idea of LeWitt's, that the work, all the information for the work is there, and that information doesn't degrade. It's ideas, and those ideas can stay constant across the decades, and the precise implementation is not the point. I mean, yes, I have specifications, and yes, this is how it should look, but that's not what the true quality of the work is. So I think with that frame of mind, the work is infinitely archival. There's no materials to degrade because it can always be reformed in whatever the material of the moment is.
So fundamental to the ADP is that conservators conduct these interviews. And this is because our questions and our engagement with artists tend to be a little bit different from a collector or a curator. ADP interviews are not merely a fact-finding mission to identify materials, dates, processes, techniques. Through these interviews, we seek to better understand the fundamental issues, be it material, conceptual, and aesthetic, and on which the artist's expression really rests and resonates. To document these processes, ensuring that the artwork can continue to convey this over time. While certain ethical considerations remain, it is important to avoid a systematic approach to materials and conservation treatment practices. Therefore, the importance of talking to artists directly is not only about the preservation of their work, but also a means of conservators to reflect on our current practice and remain sensitive to the developments and needs of contemporary art.
Yeah, I mean, I really believe deeply that decades.
So this is Carol. I wanted to revisit some of her discussion that she had with Sol LeWitt back in 2005 and just discuss how she felt about those things now and about being a conservator addressing these issues not only with just Sol LeWitt, but other artists. She recently was a curator for an exhibition called Programmed at the Whitney that incorporated a lot of these formulaic and rule-based artworks, as well as software and other time-based media works, in addition to her conservation responsibilities.
I think we are arbiters of ethical decisions because we're the hands-on. We're the ones who are doing it. You know, you can sit in a chair and have great philosophical ideas, but when something happens and you have to act, it's the conservator who's in the arena doing it. So and sometimes that's when our ethics are formed, when we're forced to act. So I do stand by that phrase. With Sol, I'm not sure because we're not acting in the sense of physically doing something, but we are acting to preserve the fact that everything has to be remade. You know, there might be a point of nostalgia. I don't know if that's so, but maybe there will be. I mean, you know, the installation of Mass Smoke Level, all his drawings, well, that's going to age. And there will maybe be a feeling about that, some sort of nostalgic feeling about that they were made while Sol was alive and so on. So it's going to be, in this case, the job of the conservator to say no. You know, the preservation of this work is to keep recreating it. That's such a conundrum, but that's the truth.
The ability to stabilize work of art without changing its appearance develops alongside material and technical evolution as well. Though the extent of any alteration that compromises the conceptual integrity of an artwork has become increasingly fundamental component of our documentation, and we do this often through interviews, the difference in how we heard Bryce Martin speak about how he felt about aging in his artwork couldn't be more different from how Sol LeWitt might feel about aging in his artwork. So for artists like LeWitt, the nature of removing their own hand gives conservators the space to de-emphasize the value of that first iteration material and strongly consider if the age condition of a work is actually misrepresenting that concept. Given the mutability of the artwork, it is essential for conservators to work through potential solutions with the artist directly, and for contemporary conservators to record the artist's voice for the sake of their successors. So this is a wall drawing that we have here at the Menil, not currently installed, but what we're left to consider is how we can continue to build a respectful practice that meaningfully engages with questions surrounding material, conceptual, and aesthetic components of LeWitt's wall drawings. This begins with contemplating the nature of the artist's participation in recreating his wall drawings within his own lifetime. Transfer from one site to another is permissible as long as the concept and system are respected, but that's one thing to say. It's another question of what exactly does that mean. So this is the certificate, and I've just highlighted the concept of this work. So on a wall with ink, with color ink washes superimposed, a grid with color ink washes superimposed. Color ink wash, the background is gray, blue, blue, gray. Vertical bands of a certain size with red and red, and then horizontal bands the size, and then also the system of colors as they're laid one on top of another. So for wall drawing 679, it was installed twice in Bill Stern's house, and so when it was accessioned into the collection here, we kept the certificate of this work, and it's no longer in the house. So I thought I would maybe propose different interpretive possibilities for this work, respecting this concept. So could this potentially be an interpretive possibility of this work? It's still has the vertical bands, it still has the horizontal bands, it's still blue, gray, blue, one on top of another. So perhaps one interpretation of that concept might see the possibility to install this work on a long horizontal wall, like that in the Menil Drawing Institute. That's not actually there, that's a little Photoshop magic. So what another interpretive possibility might be that we build a wall in its exact proportion to the wall that was in Bill Stern's house. I'm not sure about this being the correct way to bring this work into the future, because LeWitt often responded to the space that he was given. So it seems that the solution of building out a site in its exact previous specifications is unnecessary with respecting the concept and the system, and perhaps even counter to his original framework of responding to a space. Still marinating on this possibility, but I would suggest that in addition to ensuring the concept and systems are respected, the aesthetic qualities of the original space should also be considered. So transfer from one site to another must seem reasonable and apt. And often wall drawings being conceived for that specific site, I think that a wall drawing should only be recreated if a site of similar scale and proportion can be identified, and we should be wary of making too many compromises in this. But I'm definitely open to other people's ideas about what this could look like. So it's also important that the variances generated by the collaboration of the drafter interpreting the instruction should be embraced as long as it's in agreement with previous established methods. So these are two examples of wall drawing 1261. You can see the diagram on the right side there. So the diagram indicates gradation from 0 being the lightest color to 6 being the darkest color. And you can see that somehow in going one after another, they actually ended up looking quite different, but within the same, respecting the system in the same way. So LeWitt's desire for the work to remain contemporary is made possible because of the distance he created between the artwork itself and its specific material manifestation. When continuity of training individuals is conserved, the truly archival nature of dematerializing art is underscored. As long as those entrusted to execute the work continue to respect the system, something as seemingly fragile as an idea has the potential to become the most permanent, lasting art form of all. Thank you. Before moving to questions, I just wanted to acknowledge my supervisors, Brad Epley and Carol Mancusi-Ngaro, on this project, because their ideas and insights were invaluable to the process. And I also want to thank Casey Reese and John Hogan for all of their input and having these discussions with me and allowing me to ask so many questions about their work. I'd like to mention that John Hogan's going to be in Houston next week, giving a talk at Rice University on Monday, November 4th, sharing his experiences with working with Sol LeWitt for over 4 decades. So it's not to be missed.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. I have so many questions, but I'll just pick one. One is about Casey Reyes' use of the word software, which I detected was maybe more expansive than the way we sort of think of it as like the things that you put on your computer to make programs run. It seemed more expansive, more conceptual. I was wondering if you could elaborate from what you've learned from him.
Yeah. Casey was a part of developing a programming language. So when he says software, he's talking about programming. He does a lot of it in what is called processing. So, I mean, we've got someone who knows a little more about that process than I do, just over here. But he calls them software. It's programming, it's writing code, and then implementing that on a computer and being projected onto the wall most of the time. So as far as I'm aware, I would consider that software. So he's not playing with the hardware and that equipment. He's writing something to be implemented on an operating system. Thanks, Megan.
In relation to how the piece that the Menil owns would potentially be installed, were the pieces that were installed at Mass MoCA installed in previous iterations before they were installed in Mass MoCA? And if so, were there, issues of what the wall would look like in comparison to the previous installation, and would that contribute to our decisions here for installing here? Were those decisions made there?
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, the wall drawing retrospective at Mass MoCA has 105 wall drawings installed. So there had to be even a consistency within the exhibition. So if you've been there or you've seen it, all the walls are of the same height. So that's definitely a choice that was made in the course of planning the exhibition. Sol LeWitt was a part of planning that exhibition, and he acted in a way as the curator of that exhibition as well, selecting the wall drawings. But you can see, especially with the publication of the Artifacts Press catalog, wall drawing catalog raisonné that is now online, you can see a lot of variation in how those wall drawings were installed in their previous iterations and also now subsequent installations as well.
Hi, great talk. Brad, I have a question for you, or maybe for you as well. The Zerzi, the interview that you had with her, could you clarify if she was a advocate for patina, or if she wanted that change to happen with her materials? Because it wasn't really clear.
Yes, hers, I think it's interesting that she brought up the Issei analogy, because that's very much the way her art works. There's certain things that she doesn't anticipate changing, and those are not changeable, but there are other components. For example, she incorporates aspirin and Q-tips and chewing gum, and she knows that those are going to change, and she actually expects, and she thinks the viewer brings an expectation that those things are changed out. So her work is really a combination of static things and these fluid things that are changed and rotated through over time.
Yeah, the reason why I'm asking, because I did an interview with her 2 years ago, and the impression that I got from the video that she accepted the patina, but it was very much the same. There was we had newspapers in our sculpture in Cleveland, and photographs that were ripped, and she gave us quite a variety of options of ripping and also printing newspaper to show a fresh newspaper rather than the patina.
Yeah, it's interesting. She accepts that those ephemeral things change, and there's also a fine point where I wouldn't say it's clearly articulated, but she tried in that conversation with Carol to be clear that once they, from an aging standpoint, start to take on a life of their own, and maybe even literally growing other things, then that's the time to change them out and replace them. But yeah. Can I just add one more thing that may not have been evident. Christina, we're working on publishing or producing the interview, Carol's interview with Sol, and it will actually be a voiceover of Carol and Sol's interview over footage that Christina and the videographer took over 2 days at Mass MoCA, so it's going to be a really rich presentation, I think, of the interview over examples and historical images, and also the interviews that Christina did as part of her research project, which is referred to as a resound project within the ADP. The interview with Casey, the interview with John, and the interview with Carol will also be available with transcript on the ADP website shortly, too. We're hoping by the end of the year.
I had a question about the LeWitt certificates. It seemed like there is an effort made to acknowledge the first people to have executed the drawing. And so I'm wondering if in subsequent installations there is a kind of desire to harken back to the first installation as like a privileged example of that drawing, or whether there is a kind of non-hierarchical approach to all of the iterations.
A lot of the time in the interview with Carol and also John reiterated the fact that, yes, there is that sentiment with some people, and that's their opinion. That's subjective opinion that's being applied, and that's not necessarily something that he thinks needs to happen. There, specifically the works that are drafter determined works. So if there's a circle and then a line that intersects that circle, you can see that it's been revisited to potentially a favorite installation of that on occasion. I think that's what Carol was talking about in her clip with there might be a feeling about that with potentially this Mass MoCA exhibition, and the first installation I do think has a bit of privilege because of it. Potentially the concept was designed with the space in mind, right? So if Sol received a different space, he might have responded to it in a slightly different way. So there is a degree of that, but I think he would also say that that's my subjective opinion.
Hi. I wanted to say I was in New York a few years ago, and I saw in a gallery a Roy Lichtenstein, like a draft version of a temporary mural that had been executed kind of in a similar fashion. And I just think that it's very interesting the way you're all redefining conservation of artwork, back from like the traditional conservation where you need like chemicals to clean and, cleaning like an old Renaissance painting and get the old layer of like grime and time off, and how you're taking kind of a scientific approach to conserving the work, and how much of this has to do with like the interviews. Are you just in general trying to focus on artwork kind of like, in the workshop Renaissance kind of fashion with the master and the craftspeople, or the draftsmen and women, the drafters as you call them, and the interviews, how does that like tie into the actual, formula or directions or whatever scientific word you want to use for this art that seems to be losing a lot of creative interpretation, but really, like you say, it's just an iteration or reiteration.
Do you want to answer some of that?
I think I would say that in general, the interviews arise because they're, unlike the Renaissance or even up until the 19th century, there's really less, the artwork is very individual, and there's less of a conventional way of doing things. And so I think it's important to capture each artist's individual take on things. And I think that's where the interview practice is growing out of. I think what's really changing is not so much conservation, because our primary reason for doing what we do is always to ensure that what the artist intended continues through time as it passes through us, and it's clear to the next generation what should happen. So even though it's really more about artistic practice changing, I think, and that's us responding to the fact that, okay, these artists don't care that that wall be around in 200 years. It's more about understanding the fundamental thing that needs to be conveyed through time, and in many cases now, it's not material, it's idea. And so if that's the relevant thing that needs to be conveyed, then that's what we're trying to help convey. And it does lend itself to certain interpretation, and that's also important for us to record, is what the reasonable parameters for that interpretation can be. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. To figure out what the kernel is that is the essence of it. And in many cases, it's the idea.
Thank you, Brad. Christina.